Welcome, everyone. We will begin in just a moment. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today, and we'll just begin shortly. Well, good morning and welcome to our webinar today, Está Servida la Mesa, Food Insecurity in Cuba. My name's Jason Smith. I'm with the Cuba Working Group, and as many on this call know, Cuba is experiencing one of the most severe food shortages and food insecurity situations in modern history, dealing with food rationing, food shortages, inflation in food prices, and hunger. Well, I'd like to offer a welcome to all of you as we hear about these issues and learn a little bit about this crisis that is happening right now in Cuba. And thank you for joining us. My name is Jason Smith. I'm a representative of the Baptist Peace Fellowship on the Cuba Working Group, and we are glad you're joining us for the webinar. Before we begin, I want to let you know some logistical details. This is a Zoom webinar. We are recording this webinar so that we can have a copy of it to be able to share with our networks. And it is also a webinar that's being interpreted in English and in Spanish. There will be some moments shared in Spanish and English. And so if you would like to choose the language that you'd like to listen to this webinar in, you can go to the bottom. There's a little globe that says interpretation. If you click on that, you'll be able to hear the webinar in the language of your choosing. Would like to welcome you on behalf of the Cuba Working Group, which is an ecumenical collaboration of representatives from churches and denominations that seeks to build a path for peace between Cuba and the United States. We meet regularly with each other to strategize, and we also meet with representatives in government between the two countries, with U.S. members of Congress, with representatives of the Cuban embassy, and also U.S. State Department. We are eager to engage with all parties in working for peace in between our countries. And today's webinar is hosted and sponsored by the Alliance of Baptists and the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America, two members of the Cuba Working Group. We're Baptists who are in partnership with each other and also in partnership with the ecumenically friendly denominational group in Cuba, the Fraternity of Baptist Churches of Cuba. A little bit about the schedule breakdown for today's event. We will at first have an opportunity to hear from two pastors in Cuba, Reverend Waldemar Murguido Sanchez and Reverend Alicia Sevilla. And then we will hear from Professor William LeoGrande and Mr. Paul Johnson, experts in their respective fields in Cuban history and policy and also in food security issues. But first, we'd like to hear from some of our partners with the Fraternity of Baptists in Cuba. We had hoped to hear live from Reverend Alicia Damaris Sevilla Hidalgo. She is Secretary of Christian Education with the Fraternity of Baptist Churches of Cuba and pastor in Matanzas, but she's in the hospital with her mother currently. And so we're going to hear a recording of hers that she has made, and later we will hear from Reverend Waldemar Murguido Sanchez Quiros. So first, we'll hear a brief message from Reverend Sevilla.
Buen día, soy Alicia Sevilla, pastora de la Fraternidad de Iglesias Bautistas en Cuba, una iglesia llamada Fraternidad en el Naranjal, en la ciudad de Matanzas. Y me complace mucho poder estar con ustedes, al menos a través de este video, compartiendo un poco de la experiencia cubana de estos tiempos. En este momento, la situación económico, social, política e incluso religiosa en Cuba es bastante crítica. Yo creo que uno de los momentos de mayor crisis del país, que tiene también entre sus, digamos, elementos fundamentales con una crisis migratoria, la mayor crisis migratoria de todos los tiempos probablemente, hasta esta época. Y bueno, que tiene muchas causas, lo mismo vamos a ver también. Por supuesto que una de ellas, las causas principales, es el bloqueo de los Estados Unidos, pero también hay otras situaciones internas, con dificultades en la administración, decisiones que no han sido las más oportunas en los momentos más oportunos, que también han hecho mucho más difícil la situación para la gente común, para la gente que enfrenta al día a día las situaciones difíciles de la vida cotidiana. Una de las situaciones más críticas en este momento es el tema de la alimentación. Muy difícil acceder a los productos alimenticios, incluso la canasta básica, que solía estar bastante asegurada en cada barrio, un sitio que se llama bodega, ahora está también muy afectada. Y son muy pocos los productos que llegan por esa vía, que son productos a precios mucho más módicos, más accesibles para las personas. Y todos los demás lugares donde se puede acceder a adquirir productos alimenticios son en muy alto precio. Y algunos de nuevos tipos de tiendas, que son las tiendas de moneda libremente convertible, que es una moneda que no todo el mundo maneja y a la que también la persona común del día a día le cuesta mucho trabajo acceder a estos lugares donde hay, digamos, productos de mejor calidad o incluso productos que no hay en otro lugar. También el tema de la producción interna está muy disminuido. Si bien ha habido énfasis, ha habido, digamos, promoción por parte de las autoridades del país para que las personas hagan una vuelta al campo y aprecien mucho más la posibilidad de producir y de alimentarnos con productos orgánicos. Todavía muy poca la respuesta de personas que han decidido asumir este reto de producir en el campo, en los terrenos rurales. Otra de las situaciones también muy complejas en este momento tiene que ver con el acceso a medicamentos. O sea, si bien la salud sigue siendo gratuita, el acceso a las instalaciones de salud es accesible para todo el mundo, tenemos déficit de personal médico, pero otras cosas, muchas personas han migrado, y tenemos gran déficit de insumos médicos y medicamentos para trabajar. Actualmente yo llevo más de un mes más en el hospital y debo decir que el personal médico y el personal de enfermería han sido maravillosos. Sin embargo, tienen el grandísimo desafío cada día de tener que trabajar con muy pocos insumos y con ausencia total de algunos de ellos. En medio de todo eso, uno de los retos más grandes entonces para la Iglesia es alimentar la fe, tratar de transmitir esperanza. Y creo que lo que de algún modo nos llama el Espíritu a hacer es ayudar a descubrir ese Dios que camina en medio de las dificultades, ese Dios que la Biblia nos transmite en cada momento en que el pueblo estuvo pasando por momentos difíciles y terribles. Dios estaba ahí, su presencia se hacía manifiesta de una forma de otra.
We thank Reverend Sevilla for sending a message and offer our prayers. I was just WhatsApping with her a few minutes ago and offered prayers on behalf of this community with her and with her mother, who's currently in the hospital, which is why she could not join us today. We also are joined by my good friend, Waldemar Murguido Sánchez. Waldemar, es un placer que puedes estar con nosotros hoy día y te queremos dar la bienvenida. e invitarle a darnos un poco de su contexto en Matanzas, del contexto de los miembros de su comunidad en Oliva. ¿Nos puedes dar un poco desde su perspectiva como pastor y como un líder en la comunidad de la crisis en cuanto a la inseguridad con la comida? Bienvenido, hermano.
Bueno, gracias por la invitación. Agradecer a las Bautistas por la Paz y a la Alianza en esta invitación. Y también para mí es un grato de encontrarme con amigos que hace unos meses no lo veía, y a ustedes que gracias por la invitación. Bueno, yo soy pastor en una iglesia en la zona rural, a unos 30 kilómetros de la ciudad de Matanza, y en el contexto actual que estamos hablando, siempre la zona rural ha sido la más, diríamos, perjudicada. Es decir, los beneficios poco que hay, el campo siempre es la menos beneficiada. Entre ellos, mucho falta de fluido eléctrico, normalmente para la zona rural. Esto impide a veces que haya también flujo de agua. Muchas de estas comunidades viven de pozos de agua que se alimentan de turbinas eléctricas, y al no haber electricidad, esa turbina no funciona. Entonces, también el agua es una de las causas de que nos faltan. Otra de las causas también que tenemos con dificultad tiene que ver con la producción de alimentos, finalmente en la zona rural. La zona rural es una zona donde supuestamente debe haber más comida que en la zona de la ciudad, pero no es el caso. La poca comida que se produce se lleva a la ciudad. Y en estos casos también, al haber falta de petróleo o diríamos combustible, muchas personas no pueden sembrar o utilizar nuevamente lo que le pueden llamar en Cuba tractores. Vamos a hablar de lo que es un equipo para arar la tierra, para sembrar. Entonces, también trae sus dificultades. Hay también dificultades que tienen que ver con los accesos a la medicina. Hay comunidades donde yo soy pastor, es a 5 kilómetros del municipio de San Manuel de Reyes, y a veces no hay transporte para trasladarse. Entonces, eso también trae sus dificultades también con respecto a eso. Otro aspecto en la alimentación es lo que tiene que ver con el acceso a la semilla, o sea, semilla para poder sembrar también. Eso también es parte de otro desafío que tiene como personas de fe para sembrar. Y otro desafío tiene que ver con las posibilidades de que las personas puedan acceder a alimentos sanos. Normalmente a veces hay salchicha, mucho jamón, vamos a decir lo que le pueden llamar embutido. Entonces también la alimentación sana es la que a veces también nos falta mucho en la mesa, o sea, mucho también con respecto a esto. En la mesa de un cubano hoy, especialmente en la zona del campo, en mi comunidad muchas mujeres son pensionadas, vamos a decir jubiladas, que no trabajan, vienen de una pensión más o menos humilde, que solamente alcanza para acceder a la bodega, lo que se puede llamar a bodega, y si la bodega no tiene esa gran cantidad de alimentos para saciar la alimentación, hay que salir a buscar comida, y cuando salimos, la alimentación es muy cara, entonces también eso perjudica. Como decía anteriormente, la experiencia se hablaba de dos mercados diferentes, un mercado en MLC o diríamos divisa o dólares, y un mercado en moneda nacional. Pero esos mayormente mercados están en las zonas urbanas, o sea, las
Sí.
personas, en las zonas más rural, más intrincadas del campo, este tipo de mercado no llega. Entonces también es otra dificultad que tienen estas personas para acceder a alimentos. Entonces también confío. Entonces, el Estado está haciendo un gran esfuerzo también en promover la siembra de cultivos, pero si no hay recursos para sembrar, no se puede sembrar tampoco. Entonces, hace un tiempo atrás, esto sí podemos decirlo, Cuba, de ser un productor de azúcar, se convirtió en un país importador de azúcar. Entonces, eso también tiene una serie de implicaciones en la sociedad que hasta hoy se ha visto afectado. Antiguamente, cuando yo era más pequeño, no había mucha, diríamos, otros alimentos, pero el azúcar sobraba en la bodega y te duraba de un mes a otro y no había ningún problema con eso. Y un azúcar a precio muy módico. Y este azúcar ayudaba mucho a lo que le pueden llamar en Cuba dulces cubanos o dulces tradicionales cubanos, como se puede decir, fruta bomba, dulce de coco, dulce de guayaba, mermelada, que eso eran producciones nacionales. Y al no haber ese azúcar, hay que importarla, eso también encarece más los alimentos. Eso también tiene sus dificultades en Cuba. Lamentablemente son herencia o resultado de tal vez decisiones que no fueron las correctas en su momento determinado. También diríamos impuestas o motivadas también por la situación los temas Cuba-Estados Unidos, que son temas que todavía no se han resuelto, y lo que cae es siempre, cada medida que hay, implica siempre en la mesa de un cubano, ¿sabes? No implica en la mesa de un dirigente ni un director, sino en la mesa de un cubano. Entonces esto también trae consigo muchas dificultades. Solamente dar estas explicaciones a rango hecho, pero sí podemos decir que la zona rural siempre van a ser más desfavorecidas que las zonas urbanas. El campo siempre va a estar más perjudicado que otro, y entonces hay mucha gente pasando trabajo. Eso sí lo podemos decir. Hacía tiempo que yo no veía esto, pero sí veo mucha gente pasando trabajo. Gracias por todo. Ya van 5 minutos, así que bendiciones del Señor y gracias por esta invitación.
Bueno, pastor, una pregunta, con todos estos, esta crisis de agua, de producción de alimentos, acceso a medicina, ¿cómo ha respondido, cómo están respondiendo las iglesias? Y
Bueno,
en su caso, la iglesia a esta crisis de la mesa, de esta inseguridad y estas
bueno,
inseguridades.
nuestra iglesia ha respondido de diversas maneras. Hemos recibido, gracias a Dios, a muchos hermanas y hermanos de Estados Unidos, de nuestras iglesias hermanas, que han contribuido con el envío de medicamentos. Y lo que hacemos es, en el caso nuestro, en combinación con la doctora, se llama doctora del consultorio médico, nosotros con una receta médica distribuimos medicina a todas estas personas que padecen de medicamentos. Un ejemplo, tuvimos en el mes de julio un aumento de casos que se puede llamar oropuche, que está ahora con el lío del mosquito, que pica muy, que enferma a las personas, y tuvimos mucha demanda de lo que se llama acetaminofén, puede ser lo que en Cuba se llama paracetamol. Y gracias a estas donaciones, muchas personas del pueblo se beneficiaron de esta distribución de este medicamento, y la iglesia ha sido el canal de bendición para mucha gente en respuestas en momentos como este. En alimentación hemos también recibido donaciones de alimentos y lo hemos distribuido a los miembros de la iglesia y también a la comunidad donde haga falta también. Y como iglesia también decidimos tener un encuentro un sábado al mes. Es pequeño, pero podemos hacerlo un sábado al mes. Tenemos un estudio bíblico de la palabra y terminamos con un almuerzo comunitario donde todos podemos sentarnos a la mesa para comer. Es un poco sacrificado, pero lo hacemos dando respuesta al momento que estamos viviendo también. Esto es una de las herramientas que hacemos para también tenemos en la fraternidad proyectos que recibimos fondos de la iglesia canadiense y apoyamos mayormente proyectos que tienen que ver con agricultura, ¿sabes? Fondos para proyectos que tienen que ver con la siembra en lugares remotos. Tenemos iglesias mayormente en el oriente, en el occidente, que viven en zona rural y con estos proyectos ayuda, una inyección de fondos para sembrar alimentos y producir alimentos en parcelas, en pequeños espacios de tierra. Sí, ¿algo más?
Bueno, con esta inseguridad alimentaria, han surgido, como puedes hablar un poco de soluciones informales o comunitarias. Has hablado un poco de la iglesia. ¿Está la comunidad también trabajando en soluciones?
Sí, en el caso de la comunidad hay una política de Estado incentivando, muchas
Ujú,
personas siembran en sus patios, es decir,
ujú,
tienen un patio, entonces siembran, crían animales, mayormente vamos a llamarle animales vacunos, crían puercos, lo que se puede llamar cerdo,
ujú,
gallinas. Entonces también esto es una alternativa que tiene la gente para subsistir. Por ejemplo, hay pedazos de tierra, parcelas que siembran alimentos realmente naturales de Cuba, como se puede llamar lo que le llaman la vianda, que puede
ujú.
ser yuca, malanga, bonía. Entonces, a partir de esas iniciativas propias del lugar, la gente han podido responder a algún tipo de necesidades en momentos difíciles como estamos viendo. Eso también la comunidad lo ha hecho desde el punto de vista, diríamos, y lo mejor que ha sucedido que ha sido más iniciativa propia de ellos, ¿sabes? No ha sido imposición de nadie, sino porque a partir de la crisis, muchas personas buscan respuestas ante la crisis y salen a resolver muchos asuntos que tal vez por política de Estado no se puede resolver. Entonces también eso es un área donde se puede trabajar también.
Mm. Bueno, Pastor, muchas gracias por su liderazgo en Matanzas y por su participación hoy, por dar este testimonio, por su ayuda con su comunidad. Muchas gracias.
No, gracias a ustedes por la invitación. A mí fue un honor y un deber. Gracias.
Absolutamente. Well, to give us a little bit of the sort of the geopolitical history with regard to this question of food insecurity in Cuba, I'd like to bring in Professor William LeoGrande, professor of government and a specialist in Latin American politics and U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, with a special emphasis on Cuba. I'd like to bring you in, Dr. LeoGrande, to talk to us a little bit about this crisis. You know, you've called in recent years hunger a weapon that has been used by the United States government that is aggravating Cuba's food crisis. Could you tell us a little bit about Cuban families acquiring food for their households, and what's been the history of this weaponizing impact that the U.S. blockade has had on Cuba's ability to import and bring in food?
Well, thanks for having me on today, and thanks to everyone in the audience who's joined us. We've heard from our Cuban colleagues how serious the crisis is right now. I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. And there are really two principal reasons that Cuba is suffering the kind of food insecurity that it is today. One is the government's declining ability to import food because of a shortage of foreign exchange currency. And the other, as our Cuban colleagues have talked about, is the declining agricultural production, which is down 35% since 2019. And that's been caused by government policies, including Cuban government policies, that is, including inadequate investment, prices that are below the farmer's cost of production and don't really give them much incentive to increase production. Then you've got natural disasters, which are increasing, hurricanes and drought because of climate change. And then finally, again, declining foreign exchange earnings that have created shortages of seed, fertilizer, equipment, and fuel. I want to focus mostly on the issue of declining foreign exchange because that impacts both domestic production and imports. Cuba imports about 70% of its food. And this is the factor that the United States is having a direct impact on. Today, almost the entire ration or daily basket of goods that Cuban families are able to get at subsidized prices has almost all of that is imported. And the result is that what's available on the ration has been decreasing. The shortages of foreign exchange have led to delays in the availability of ration goods and a constriction of what's actually offered. The severe decline in hard currency or foreign exchange currency earnings really goes back to the Trump sanctions and to the COVID pandemic. Trump's policy was one of what they themselves call maximum pressure, which was designed to starve the country of foreign exchange currency, with the result of literally trying to starve the Cuban population. In 2019, before the pandemic began, and when the maximum pressure policy was put in place, Cuba had three principal sources of foreign exchange earnings. One was tourism. Second was remittances, mostly coming from people in the United States. And the third was the export of medical services, especially, but not exclusively, to Venezuela. So Trump restricted U.S. travel, reduced air service to Cuba from the United States, and banned cruise ships. And the result of that cut total travel to Cuba, not just U.S. travel, total travel to Cuba by about 15%. And that was before COVID. And then, of course, COVID closed the Cuban tourism industry for almost 2 full years, and that industry has not fully recovered even today. And Biden has left some of these Trump sanctions on travel in place. The Trump administration halted wire services for sending remittances to Cuba. And then COVID prevented Cuban Americans from carrying remittances themselves because COVID closed travel back and forth. And so during that period, right, 2020, 2021, remittances fell by about 2/3. Some of that has recovered now, but the money is circulating now primarily through private sector enterprises, which means that the government is not capturing it, and it's not available for the government to import food that it can provide to people at low prices. President Trump pressured other countries to end their medical service contracts with Cuba and sanctioned companies transporting Venezuelan oil to Cuba. And the result of that has been a decline in the Cuban earnings from the export of medical services. President Biden has continued to put diplomatic pressure on those countries that have medical service contracts, and he's left the oil sanctions in place. And finally, Trump imposed or put Cuba back on the State Department's list of state sponsors of international terrorism with no factual foundation, I should add. And Biden so far has left them there. And that increases the difficulty, complicates Cuba's ability to engage in international financial transactions, including the import of food. And so it raises the cost of absolutely everything that Cuba tries to import. So all of these measures taken together have caused a decline in Cuba's foreign exchange earnings of over 50%, and a decline of imports by almost 50%. And those imports are primarily food, medicine, and fuel. And so the result is the severe food insecurity that we see today. Biden claims that his policies is aimed at supporting the Cuban people while being tough on the Cuban government. But you can't starve the government of foreign exchange earnings without starving the Cuban people as well. The other thing that's been happening around food is the expansion of inequality. Because the private sector now is importing food and selling it, it's importing it and selling it at international market prices. And that means that the only people who can really access that food are people who are getting remittances from family abroad, or who are somehow earning remittances, say if they're working in the private sector themselves, maybe getting paid in remittances or getting paid in foreign exchange currency, earning foreign exchange currency. And so you see now something that really historically has not been the case in Cuba, where you have almost a kind of caste system of people who have access to dollars and people who don't have access to dollars. And it's the people who don't have access to dollars, especially in rural areas, as we've heard, that are suffering the most at this really critical moment. Thanks.
Thank you. This is also coming with Cuba's being isolated too. I mean, how have Cuba's relationships with some of its allies also affected its ability to secure food resources? Countries like Russia historically, and China. Is this also had an impact on declining imports and declining foreign exchange?
So I don't think it's not so much that Cuba is isolated, because really it's not. It's the United States policy toward Cuba that's really isolated, as the UN General Assembly tells us every year when they vote overwhelmingly for the United States to lift the embargo. But the international situation has made a big difference. So the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, inflation that we saw around the world over the last few years has driven up the price of food, driven up the price of transport. And so all of those things have contributed to basically creating a situation where what little foreign exchange currency Cuba has is buying less and less every year.
Thanks so much, Professor LeoGrande. We will, I neglected to mention earlier on too, that we'll have an opportunity, hopefully at the end, to take some questions from the audience. So if you could have those prepared for any of our panelists, we'll take questions here at the end. Thank you, Dr. LeoGrande. I'd like to also bring in Paul Johnson, who is a partner at Focus Cuba Consulting, but who is also chair of the U.S. Agriculture Coalition for Cuba. He founded Chicago Foods International, which has engagement, business engagement, exporting food to Cuba in its national and its tourism markets. And Paul, we were just mentioned to you earlier that I read that you were in Cuba in the 1990s, in the special period. And so, I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about this food crisis, how it compares to that of the 1990s that you've seen in your career, and talk to us a little bit about the work of U.S. Agriculture Coalition for Cuba and what you've been able to do over the last 10 years or so.
Sounds good. Let me address that during this presentation.
Great.
Well, again, thank you for this opportunity, for putting this together. I'm delighted to be a part of this panel to learn from everyone here on how to improve our relations with Cuba. Let me start by stating the obvious that has been stated today amongst the speakers. There is a humanitarian need in Cuba to address food shortages. The present food crisis has implications for the United States in regards our own national security and foreign policy interests. Food crisis, mass migration, and the private sector are intertwined, and I believe need to be the focus of our political and commercial approach to Cuba today. On a humanitarian level, the United States can do much more to alleviate the present crisis. In regards migration, Cuba's recovery will be further stifled as most of the 10% who have left the country in the past 2 years are the youth and educated. Such alarming migration figures impact U.S. national security. The exodus is showing no signs of slowing, and if we want to curb the number of people leaving Cuba and entering the United States, we will have to address the food crisis. To talk about food security, we need to discuss agriculture production in Cuba, which has sharply decreased with no reason to believe that it will improve in the short term. The government doesn't have the money to purchase basic inputs such as fuel, fertilizer, and animal feed. Last year, they purchased only 40% of required diesel fuel, 4% of fertilizers, and 20% of animal feed. 2 years ago, there were 8 million egg layers. Today, that number has decreased to 2.9 million. Pork production in 2022 was around 250,000 tons. Today, it is 20,000 tons, a decrease of 90%. Another hurdle is convincing the younger generations to farm rather than leave the country or move to urban centers. Only 15% of the Cuban population lives in the countryside. Certainly, U.S. sanctions impair the government's ability to acquire needed inputs. But Cuba has internal barriers of its own. Lack of incentives and agricultural development loans to producers, a continued reliance on a centralized economy, a disproportionate investment in tourism and hotels rather than food production, and presently, an inability of the government to unleash their agriculture potential by creating economically sustainable ties within the state, private, and cooperative entities. While underproduction is the biggest problem, it's not the only one. A dependence on food imports, along with rising food costs, means that their food ration system is unable to meet the daily needs of Cubans. I'm not saying there is hunger in Cuba, and certainly there are other countries in the world worse off. And the Cuban government is uncomfortable with the word hunger, not only because of their pride, but because those in the United States who favor the embargo have historically used deteriorating conditions in Cuba to justify an increase in sanctions rather than an opportunity to resolve it. But to answer your question, I do remember Cuba in the 1990s, and the comparisons to the special period are apt. I remember the lack of nutrition, its health implications to both the young and older generations, and we will be dealing with the repercussions of a lack of nutrition in Cuba for decades to come. One way to address food security is through their private sector and agricultural cooperatives. The emergence of Cuba's private sector is transforming Cuba's economy, one where a dynamic and entrepreneurial base is now responsible for importing much of Cuba's food and providing employment. This economic transition has created a stark divide between those reliant on the government for subsidized goods and those who have access to US dollars to shop at private sector stores. Keep in mind that the state enterprises and the government employ roughly 2/3 of Cuba's workforce, with the remainder employed by the private sector and cooperatives. The Cuban government's path towards developing a mixed economy is fraught with opposition, both within the country and abroad. Policy measures that would bolster the private sector are diluted to accommodate those within the government that are weary of it overpowering the socialist state and the programs most of the population depend. While regulating the market to meet the needs of a dependent population is customary, the government goes beyond by trying to control it, with the result that economic measures only stifle the ability of the private sector and cooperatives to address food security. It's noteworthy that US food exports to Cuba are up nearly 30% in the first 6 months of this year compared to the same time last year. Total US food exports last year were $336 million. We'll have to see how Cuba's recently announced private sector measures will impact future sales. But roughly 75% of all current US food exports are poultry meat. But the range of goods being sold has expanded, and it's the private sector that has become the largest buyer on the island. So what can we do? What can the United States do to address the food crisis in Cuba? First, do more with the support for Cuban people policy. Current US policy towards Cuba is a two-pronged approach. The first is aimed at improving human rights, and the second is to support the Cuban people. Cuba's shift towards a more participatory economy provides an opportunity for the United States to support agricultural reform to support the Cuban people. If we truly want to support the Cuban people, there is no larger impact than the agricultural sector. Agriculture affects everyone on the island, and nearly 20% of the workforce is employed in the sector, making it the largest in their economy. Yet Cuban agriculture is a blind spot in US policy and engagement. Our agricultural policy doesn't begin to address concerns that ensure plant and animal pests and diseases do not spread, or confirm the safety and health of our food exports. Second, work with Congress and the administration to amend the Trade Sanctions and Export Enhancement Act, or TSRA. That law was passed in 2000 and is the reason that we can legally export food to Cuba. but much has changed in the past nearly 25 years, and the law should be amended to improve the competitiveness of U.S. exports. An amended TSRA presents a conduit to both resolving the current food crisis and increasing trade by permitting capital investment and credit to Cuba's private sector, agricultural cooperatives, as well as their links to Cuba's state companies. Third, engage the private sector and agriculture cooperatives with investment. Informal investment and trade channels between Cubans on the island and Cuban Americans have always existed. It is estimated that $3 to $4 billion in remittances flow from the U.S. to Cuba annually. Cuba's new private sector regulations are an attempt to formalize this process, bringing trade and investment out of legal ambiguity and making it more transparent. The United States should do more to bring this process along. Economic development is freedom. More trade and exchange lead to economic and social change. That is the MO of U.S. foreign policy. By supporting the private sector and agriculture cooperatives, we are supporting the growth of a middle class that represents 1/3 of the workforce in Cuba today. In conclusion, there is a crisis in Cuba that is only going to get worse. Food security and mass migration present threats to the national security of the United States and Cuba. Both can be alleviated with more U.S. support, specifically towards Cuba's private sector that includes farm cooperatives. U.S. policy towards Cuba hurts those we claim to support. While we champion improved human rights on the island, we cannot improve the rights of Cubans by restricting the rights of U.S. citizens to freely travel and do business. The demand for more agricultural trade and investment within a Cuban market certainly exists. Cuba's economic shift to a mixed economy is not complete nor perfect, but it is significant. The U.S. should support Cuban citizens on this transformative process, both to support the Cuban people, to protect our national interests, and to help resolve the current food crisis.
Thanks so much, Paul. Appreciate those suggestions and your work with in Cuba. There's a question in the chat from Jack, and we're going to go back to Professor LeoGrande, and we'll move into a time of answering questions. If you do have a question, I say the chat, you can use the Q&A feature in the button below. And there's a question about the internal banking crisis and how it relates to the food crisis also. Jack writes, I understand the majority of foreign currency held by the private sector and church sectors held in cash and never deposited into FIC accounts. I also understand Cubans are not, as of a few weeks ago, even able to withdraw paper money from CUP accounts. Is this the case? And can you talk to us about this, the banking crisis?
Sure. You know, in days before the pandemic, most of the remittances that flowed into Cuba flowed through the Cuban banking system. And so the recipient on the Cuban end would either get Cuban pesos, or they would get an electronic currency that was called MLC, and they could get a debit card that they could then use in stores to buy things, in dollar stores to buy things. But because wire service remittances were cut off by Trump, and then the pandemic made it difficult for people to carry remittances down, Cubans have found sort of workarounds to it. And with the opening of private enterprises in the retail sector, as Paul was saying, the retail private businesses are importing lots and lots of things. And so now Cubans are getting their remittances directly, not through the Cuban banking system, They're spending them in these private sector stores. And then the private sector store owners are making a profit, and they're using the dollars to buy more things abroad to import. And none of that money is circulating through the national banking system, which means the government is not capturing it and being able to use it to finance imports. And the government has actually responded to this by changing banking regulations to try to force the private sector to deposit all their receipts immediately into the banking system and to conduct all their transactions electronically, so the government has a record of what they're doing. But of course, the private sector is not really complying with that. And the reason is that if they were in fact to deposit their dollar receipts in the banking system, they can't get them back out again. It hasn't been possible for now a long time for Cubans to actually withdraw hard currency in cash from their bank accounts. And the reason, of course, is because the government doesn't have it. So that's the dilemma. In terms of people not being able to withdraw even Cuban pesos, I suspect that may be a simple result of not having the physical cash. And that's because of the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation and particularly the exchange rates have gone up so dramatically that the government is literally short of physical currency to be able to distribute.
Thank you, Dr. LeoGrande. We've got a few other questions. Paul, we're going to head back over to you. There's a question from Edward talking about, why not just lift the U.S. failed embargo? And if it's okay, I'm going to ask a bit question related to that as well. Why not lift the U.S. failed embargo? And, you offered some steps that the U.S. can do to address the food crisis. I'm wondering, do you think that, you've said in the past that you don't have a lot of hope that the embargo is going to end. And do you think that, that further investment in agriculture could lead to an end of the embargo in Cuba?
Well, I would hope that we can work together to make incremental steps to eat away at the embargo. But yeah, I don't see anything that's going to help us to actually end the embargo outright. Obviously, the next election looms large. There's more possibilities, but historically speaking, I mean, whether you're Democrat or Republican, none of them have been very good to Cuba. So I go back to relying on the groups like we have together here and to advocate. And I love this group because, you don't just talk about things, you do things, and we fill in the margins where we can. And I suppose that's the most we can do by going to Cuba, by building relationships, helping one another out in times of crisis. I mean, and that's what's to me is most important. It's interesting on the food side, we passed a law 25 years ago, TISRA, and we made a dent, and that's had an impact. It doesn't go far enough, but I was leading to that in my conversation, that I think if we have groups like this, agricultural groups, to get together and talk about those three issues, food crisis, mass migration, and private sector, those are appealing to both R&Ds. So with that in mind, when you go to the Hill, when you talk to your local congressman, those are the themes I think we should be talking about. And then amending the existing law we have to export food, to expand it to allow for more investment and further trade with the island.
Paul, what do you think about U.S. churches working with groups, non-governmental groups like the UN World Food Program to help with Cuba? Is that an approach that churches can also take?
That's great. And there are church groups working with the World Food Program today in Cuba. I know there was one church that made an anonymous donation of a very large amount of money this year. And I will put the gentleman from the UN Food Program in Cuba's contact email in this chat, and he would love to hear from you.
Great. There's a question, there's a question about details about the law that you mentioned on advocating for it specifically. And if you could include, can you include those details as well?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Susan Smith, she says, can we have more details about this law Paul mentioned to advocate specifically?
The Trade Sanction Reform and Export Enhancement Act, is that what you're referring to?
I think so.
So that's the law that was passed in 2000 that allowed U.S. Companies to export food to Cuba, but it's very limited and somewhat outdated. It's been 25 years. One stipulation is that we can only export food on credit. I'm sorry, on cash in advance. We cannot use credit. Now, a lot of people don't like this idea of offering credit to Cuba because they have a terrible track record of repayment of debt. That's true. But my argument is we're not asking for the United States government to offer credit. We're asking private banks and individuals and companies to assume their own risk, their own country risk, and be able to do that like we do in other parts of the world. I think through that, by offering credit, we would see an increase in trade. And I would like to expand it further to allow for investment in agricultural production. It's not just about one-way trade. We need to increase local production in Cuba. And one way of doing that is by allowing U.S. investors to invest in Cuban agriculture. It's not easy. It's going to be very difficult to work through the Ministry of Agriculture on this. But if we were allowed to do it on our side, it would put pressure on Cubans to change their internal laws. And I don't see us getting out of this mess unless we have capital investment to actually increase local production, which also includes investment to allow them to export goods to the United States, which frankly we don't do. We only allow Cuba to export artisanal charcoal and some coffee that goes to Nespresso. So we need to expand that list of products that can be imported to foment, to increase local production in Cuba.
Let me add 2 quick points to that. One is,
Sure.
I think it may be possible for the president actually to change the regulations around the embargo to allow for investment in private agricultural and cooperative sector. So maybe you may not even have to change, and not that TSFR shouldn't be changed, it should, but we may not have to do it in order to allow that kind of investment. Second thing that people can advocate around, though, is that the United States government itself begin providing humanitarian assistance to Cuba in the area of food and medicine. The law allows a humanitarian exception for the embargo on Cuba. So all the president has to do is decide that he wants to do it or she wants to do it.
Wow. That would be that's huge. And that's definitely where our efforts should be directed. There's a question to Dr. LeoGrande that I'm going to pose to you. And you know, we know that it was at the end of President Obama's term that some movement happened in Cuba. And there's a question in the chat that, is there any possibility that if Harris is elected, Biden might rescind some of the more onerous restrictions that he has thus far maintained? I'm guessing that would be in the last 2 months of his presidency.
There's been some speculation about that as a possibility. I suspect that there might be a couple of things that would get done. Things that they have, things in which there's been some internal consensus as far as we can tell, but they haven't actually acted on them because of the upcoming election. Things like taking Cuba off the terrorism list, for example. But of course, obviously, this would only be done in consultation with the president-elect. And I have actually reasonable hope that a Harris administration would be more open to returning to Obama's policy of engagement than Biden has been. Her track record on the Cuba issue is pretty sparse, but what we've seen has been generally positive. So when she was a candidate for presidential nomination back in 2020, She said that the embargo should be lifted, that it was outdated. When she was in the Senate, she twice signed on as a co-sponsor to bills to lift the ban on travel to Cuba. And you know, she was in charge of trying to fix the root causes of migration in Central America. And her proposal was, you have to build these economies. You have to give people opportunity. You have to give them hope for the future so that they feel like staying in their home country, they have life chances. So she will understand that the current migration crisis in Cuba is being aggravated by U.S. policy, not helped by it. And hopefully that will lead her to some different policies than we've seen from Biden.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing in this time. I'm going to turn it over now to Reverend April Baker. She is Mission and Ministry Partner Liaison with the Alliance of Baptists and is also pastor of Glendale Baptist Church, to offer our closing today. But once again, a thank you to Alicia Sevilla. Thank you to Waldemar Murillo Sanchez, to William LeoGrande, thank you, and to Paul Johnson. April, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jason. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'll echo Jason's gratitude for your time and your wisdom and for sharing with us. So our question, some of which has been at least addressed, is what can we do? Those of us who are U.S. citizens do have a responsibility to call on our government to act in ways that are just and humane. Some continued pressure to lift the embargo. Right now, that the situation in Cuba is certainly exacerbated by the U.S. State Department having Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. The embargo restricts financial institutions. The restrictions actually cause financial institutions just to over-comply with those restrictions. And so the Alliance of Baptists and my church have both had funds held, funds that were given for our broad ministries. Because we have connections in Cuba, all of those funds would have been used legally and in compliance with those restrictions, but the online processors are afraid of those restrictions. And so there have been issues like that with financial institutions over and over again. Carol Blythe is going to drop a link in the chat that's going to take you to an action page for the Latin America Working Group. Latin America Working Group is a tremendous resource for ways to address some of the issues that our Cuban friends and neighbors are confronting with the U.S. government. This will take you to a script that's there for calling the White House switchboard, asking the administration to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list immediately. Other things you might do: subscribe to the Latin America Working Group email so you can stay informed and be up to date. Respond to the calls to action that are listed there on occasion. If you're part of a religious organization that has a relationship with an organization in Cuba, get involved. If you have the chance to go and visit. Get to know people, build relationships, share information, communicate with your congressional representatives. And the list, call, write, email, distribute accurate information through social media. The continued pressure that we have and influence that we have may not get to the biggest changes that we'd like to make, but we have seen an impact in them. And so your voice in continuing that pressure is really important. I want to thank you all for being part of this conversation today, for the care and concern that you offer, and your presence is a statement of interest in creating something that's more equitable and more just and that leads us to a better world. And so I really appreciate that, and appreciate any action that you can take to support our Cuban neighbors. I'll leave us with a few words of hope and blessing. There is a spirit that fills spaces between us, between individuals and communities and nations. It's a spirit that insists on our interdependence, and makes it possible that our actions can indeed have an impact on our world and on each other. And so, carrying this spirit of love and goodness, may our work and our lives lead toward a world where the only law needed is the law of love, where justice is a given, assured as a norm, where all have what they need, where we rely on each other, and where all earth flourishes to its very fullest possibility. Thank you all.